Jack Thompson had always been a man of precision. As an architect, he could design a building so flawless that even gravity had to pause and admire his work. But today, Jack wasn't drafting blueprints or calculating load-bearing walls. No, today Jack was staring at a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, and it was the architectural equivalent of being told by a toddler that your Lego tower was too ugly. The letter was short, sharp, and dripping with passive-aggressive authority. Dear Mr. Thompson, it began. Your request to construct a detached office in your backyard has been denied due to non-compliance with HOA aesthetic guidelines. We appreciate your understanding. Jack didn't appreciate anything. He crumpled the paper into a ball and threw it across the room like it was an enemy trebuchet attacking his castle. Non-compliance with aesthetic guidelines? Jack muttered, pacing his living room. I designed half the downtown skyline. I am the aesthetic guideline. But none of that mattered to the HOA, a shadowy cabal of suburban overlords whose power rivaled that of ancient emperors, if ancient emperors cared deeply about mailbox uniformity and lawn height. Jack had moved into this gated community in Florida 6 months ago, lured by promises of peace, quiet, and palm trees swaying gently in the breeze. What he hadn't anticipated was the HOA's iron-fisted rule over every square inch of his property. They were like bureaucratic ninjas, silent but deadly, striking with fines for offenses as trivial as parking too close to the curb or planting flowers that weren't HOA-approved shades of beige. The detached office Jack wanted to build wasn't some grandiose monstrosity. It was a modest 12 by 12 structure with clean lines and eco-friendly materials, a sanctuary where he could escape the chaos of his day job and focus on personal projects. But apparently, it didn't meet the HOA's vision for the neighborhood, which Jack suspected involved turning every backyard into a lifeless patch of grass suitable only for existential crises. Jack wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially not one as absurd as this. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting to plead his case. Armed with architectural renderings so beautiful they could make Michelangelo weep, Jack strode into the community center like a man on a mission. The meeting was exactly what he expected. A room full of people who took their roles far too seriously. At the head of the table sat Karen McAllister, HOA president and self-proclaimed guardian of suburban harmony. Karen had the demeanor of someone who'd once argued with a cashier over expired coupons, and won. Mr. Thompson, Karen said, her smile as sharp as her bob haircut. We're glad you could join us. Let's discuss your proposal. Jack presented his plans with all the passion of an artist unveiling their masterpiece. He explained how the office would blend seamlessly with the environment, how it would increase property values, and how it adhered to every zoning law known to man. Karen nodded politely before delivering her verdict. It's still a no. Jack blinked. Excuse me, it doesn't align with our community's aesthetic standards, Karen said, as if she were rejecting an audition for Broadway rather than crushing someone's dream. Jack looked around the room for support but found only blank stares and awkward coughs. The HOA board members were loyal to Karen, or perhaps just afraid of her, and none dared challenge her decision. Fine, Jack said through gritted teeth. I'll revise my plans. But no matter how many revisions Jack submitted over the following weeks, smaller dimensions, different materials, even painting it beige, the answer was always the same: denied. The rejection letters piled up like unpaid parking tickets, each one more infuriating than the last. Jack began to suspect that Karen wasn't rejecting his plans because they violated aesthetic guidelines. She was rejecting them because she could. The HOA wasn't about maintaining harmony, it was about power. One evening, as Jack sat in his backyard staring at the empty space where his office should have been, he had an epiphany. Karen didn't know who she was dealing with. You see, Jack wasn't just an architect. He was also the director of Florida's State Building Authority, the very agency responsible for approving construction permits across the state. In other words, Karen had been denying permits issued by him. It was like watching someone argue with their own reflection in a mirror. Jack decided it was time to remind Karen who held the real power in this equation. Not out of spite, well, maybe a little, but out of principle. He drafted one final set of plans for his office and stamped them with the official seal of approval from his agency. Then he mailed them directly to Karen with a note attached. Approved by Florida State Building Authority. The next day, Karen showed up at Jack's house unannounced. A rare occurrence given her preference for passive-aggressive emails. "Mr. Thompson," she said stiffly, holding up his plans like they were evidence in a courtroom drama. "What is this?" "It's my permit," Jack replied casually. "Signed by me." Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign at rush hour. "You can't approve your own project." "Actually," Jack said with a grin that could rival Mona Lisa's mystery, "I can." Karen sputtered incoherently for several seconds before storming off in defeat. A moment so satisfying it felt like winning an Oscar for Best Revenge Plot. Construction began on Jack's office later that week under his direct supervision and occasional smug commentary. Neighbors stopped by to admire his work and congratulate him on standing up to the HOA, a victory that quickly became local legend. As for Karen, she resigned from her position shortly after realizing she'd picked a fight she couldn't win. Rumor has it she moved to another neighborhood where HOAs are less tyrannical, or perhaps just less likely to include state officials among their residents. And Jack? He spent many happy hours in his backyard office designing buildings that would stand as monuments to creativity, and maybe just a tiny bit of petty revenge. Jack had always considered himself a patient man. After all, you don't build a career in architecture without learning to handle the occasional unreasonable client who insists on putting a spiral staircase in their bathroom or demands a house shaped like a pineapple. But as the weeks dragged on and the HOA continued to deny his construction requests, Jack realized that his patience was being tested in ways he hadn't thought possible. The HOA's rejections were becoming increasingly absurd, each one more ridiculous than the last. First, they claimed his proposed office was too modern for the neighborhood. Jack adjusted the design to include more traditional elements: wooden siding, gabled rooflines, even a porch swing for good measure. The HOA responded with a terse letter stating that the structure was now too rustic. It was like playing chess with a pigeon. No matter what move he made, they knocked over the pieces and pooped on the board. Then came the color wars. Jack had initially planned to paint the office a tasteful shade of slate gray, but Karen McAllister, the HOA president and self-appointed czar of suburban aesthetics, vetoed it on the grounds that it was too somber. When Jack resubmitted his plans with a cheerful sky blue exterior, Karen declared it too whimsical. At one point, Jack sarcastically suggested painting it invisible and received an actual reply stating that transparent buildings were not permitted under HOA guidelines. But the final straw came when Karen sent him a letter accusing him of violating an HOA bylaw he hadn't even known existed. Rule 47B, which apparently prohibited any structure that could be used for non-residential purposes. Jack stared at the letter in disbelief. Non-residential purposes? What did they think he was going to do? Open a nightclub in his backyard? Fueled by equal parts frustration and caffeine, Jack decided to dig deeper into the HOA's bylaws. He spent hours poring over their rulebook, which was less a set of guidelines and more of a manifesto for micromanagement. There were rules about acceptable mulch colors, brown or black only, rules about holiday decorations, no inflatable Santas taller than 6 feet, and even rules about lawn gnome placement, 1 per yard, no exceptions. It was as if Karen had personally designed these regulations to crush any spark of individuality within a 10-mile radius. Jack began to suspect that Karen's vendetta against him wasn't just about his office. It was personal. After all, she hadn't batted an eye when another neighbor installed a hideous gazebo that looked like it had been stolen from a carnival. And yet here she was, treating Jack's modest office like it was an affront to civilization itself. The hypocrisy was maddening. Determined to fight back, Jack decided to attend another HOA meeting. This time, he came armed not only with revised plans but also with photographic evidence of other homeowners' violations. Violations that had mysteriously gone unpunished. There was the neighbor with an unapproved koi pond, another with an illegal pergola, and yet another who had painted their front door neon green. A crime against humanity if there ever was one. Jack printed out the photos and stapled them to copies of the relevant bylaws for maximum dramatic effect. The meeting started as predictably as ever. Karen presiding at the head of the table like a dictator at her throne, flanked by her loyal minions who nodded at everything she said as if their necks were on springs. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he stood up and delivered what could only be described as an architectural filibuster. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with exaggerated politeness, "I come before you today not just as a homeowner but as an artist, a creator, who wishes only to enhance this community with my humble project." He held up his revised plans like they were sacred texts. "Behold, a structure so harmonious with its surroundings that even nature itself would weep tears of joy." Karen rolled her eyes so hard that Jack feared she might sprain something. "Mr. Thompson," she interrupted, "we've already reviewed your plans." And yet, Jack cut her off. "You approved this monstrosity." He slammed down a photo of the carnival gazebo for everyone to see. Gasps echoed around the room. One board member whispered something about how they'd always hated that gazebo but didn't dare say anything. Karen's face turned crimson. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "Oh, is it?" Jack countered, pulling out more photos like an attorney presenting evidence in court. "What about this koi pond? Or this neon green door? Or this pergola that looks like it's auditioning for ugliest structures in America?" The room descended into chaos as other homeowners began chiming in with their own grievances against Karen and her arbitrary rulings. One elderly woman stood up and shouted something about how Karen had fined her $50 for having garden gnomes while ignoring another neighbor's inflatable flamingo collection. Karen tried desperately to regain control of the meeting, banging her gavel so hard that it broke in half. But it was too late, the tide had turned. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, Jack felt something he hadn't expected: solidarity. After what felt like hours of heated debate, Karen finally adjourned the meeting with a promise to review Jack's plans once again. But Jack knew better than to get his hopes up. The battle might be over for now, but the war against suburban tyranny raged on. As he walked home that night under the glow of streetlights, which were probably regulated by some obscure HOA rule, Jack couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. He'd moved into this neighborhood seeking peace and quiet, but had instead found himself embroiled in what could only be described as a Shakespearean drama. If Shakespeare wrote plays about mulch colors and lawn gnomes. Still, there was something oddly satisfying about standing up to Karen and her cronies. For better or worse, Jack realized he wasn't just fighting for his office. He was fighting for every homeowner who'd ever been told their mailbox wasn't navy blue enough, or their grass wasn't short enough, or their dreams weren't small enough. And if Karen thought she could outlast him, well, she clearly didn't know who she was dealing with yet. Jack had always prided himself on being a reasonable man. But as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at yet another rejection letter from the HOA, this one claiming his proposed office violated an obscure rule about maintaining the visual serenity of the neighborhood, he realized that reason had officially left the building. It was time for action. No more Mr. Nice Architect. The problem with Karen McAllister and her HOA cronies, Jack mused, was that they had no idea who they were dealing with. Sure, they knew him as the guy who occasionally mowed his lawn on a Saturday morning and waved politely at neighbors during his evening jogs. What they didn't know was that Jack Thompson wasn't just any homeowner. He was the director of Florida's State Building Authority. In essence, he was the guy who could approve or deny construction projects across the entire state. And Karen? Karen was a glorified hall monitor with a clipboard. Jack decided it was time to use his position to level the playing field, or more accurately, to tilt it entirely in his favor. He started by pulling up every document related to the HOA's operations that he could get his hands on. Financial reports, meeting minutes, bylaws, it was all public record, and Jack devoured it like a man binge-watching a scandalous reality TV show. What he found was both infuriating and hilarious. The HOA wasn't just overzealous. It was incompetent. Their bylaws were riddled with contradictions. Their financial records were a mess, and their enforcement of rules was so inconsistent it bordered on parody. One homeowner had been fined for having a mailbox that was 2 inches too tall, while another had been allowed to build a backyard tiki bar complete with neon lights and a karaoke machine. But the real jackpot came when Jack discovered that Karen herself had violated several HOA rules over the years. Her backyard shed? Unapproved color. Her flower beds? Planted too close to the property line. And her driveway? Resurfaced without proper permits. It was like finding out that the principal of your high school secretly cheated on their own exams. Armed with this knowledge, Jack decided to play the long game. He began attending HOA meetings not as an aggrieved homeowner but as an interested observer, sitting quietly in the back and taking notes while Karen and her minions pontificated about mulch and mailbox heights. He even volunteered for a few community events, earning himself a reputation as a team player. It was all part of his master plan. Lull them into a false sense of security before delivering the coup de grace. Meanwhile, Jack quietly began preparing his own construction project. Not just an office, but a full-blown architectural masterpiece designed to make Karen's head explode. It would be sleek, modern, and unapologetically bold. A structure so stunning it would make Frank Lloyd Wright rise from the grave just to give him a standing ovation. Of course, Jack knew that getting this project approved through normal channels would be impossible. So he didn't bother trying. Instead, he used his position at the State Building Authority to fast-track his plans through every level of bureaucracy imaginable. By the time Karen caught wind of what he was up to, construction crews were already pouring concrete in his backyard. Karen showed up at Jack's house within hours of hearing the news, clipboard in hand and fury in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she barked, marching up his driveway like a general preparing for battle. "What is going on here?" "Construction," Jack replied cheerfully, gesturing toward the workers in hard hats who were busy assembling scaffolding. "You don't have approval from the HOA," Karen snapped. "Oh, but I do," Jack said, pulling out a stack of documents stamped with official seals from various state agencies. "You see, Karen, my project has been approved by every relevant authority, including me." Karen's face turned so red it looked like she might spontaneously combust on the spot. "You can't just bypass the HOA. Actually," Jack said with a grin that could power an entire city grid, "I can." Karen sputtered incoherently for several seconds before storming off in defeat. A moment so satisfying it felt like winning an Oscar for Best Revenge Plot. But Jack wasn't done yet. Over the next few weeks, he continued building his office while simultaneously exposing Karen's hypocrisy at every turn. He filed formal complaints about her unapproved shed and flower beds, citing chapter and verse from the HOA bylaws she loved to wield against others. He even sent her a polite letter suggesting she repaint her driveway to comply with community standards. The neighborhood quickly caught wind of what was happening, and Jack became something of a local hero. A suburban Robin Hood taking down the tyrannical sheriff of Nottingham one petty rule at a time. Neighbors who had once feared Karen now openly mocked her behind her back, sharing stories about her ridiculous fines and over-the-top enforcement tactics. Karen tried desperately to regain control of the situation, calling emergency HOA meetings and sending out increasingly frantic emails warning residents about unauthorized activities. But it was too late. The tide had turned against her, and she knew it. By the time Jack's office was completed, a stunning glass and steel structure that looked like it belonged in Architectural Digest rather than someone's backyard, Karen had all but given up trying to fight him. She resigned from her position shortly afterward, citing personal reasons, but leaving behind a legacy of bitterness and broken gavel handles. As for Jack, he spent many happy hours in his new office designing buildings that would stand as monuments to creativity, and maybe just a tiny bit of petty revenge. Jack's backyard office was finally complete, and it was nothing short of a masterpiece. The sleek glass walls reflected the Florida sunshine like a beacon of defiance, while the minimalist steel frame stood as a monument to modern design, and Jack's unrelenting determination to stick it to the HOA. It was the kind of structure that made people stop and stare, mouths agape, wondering if they'd accidentally wandered into an episode of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. The day construction finished, Jack stood in his backyard, sipping a celebratory cup of coffee and admiring his handiwork. He had done it. He had beaten Karen McAllister and her army of clipboard-wielding suburban enforcers at their own game. And he hadn't just won, he had triumphed in spectacular fashion. The office wasn't just functional, it was a statement, a declaration that creativity could thrive even in the most oppressive HOA-controlled environments. Naturally, the neighbors were curious. Over the next few days, they began trickling into Jack's backyard, eager to see the infamous structure that had caused such a stir. Some came out of genuine admiration for Jack's architectural skills, while others were simply there for the gossip. Either way, Jack welcomed them all with open arms and a healthy dose of smugness. "This is incredible," said Mrs. Jenkins from next door, her eyes wide as she took in the soaring ceilings and polished concrete floors. "I can't believe you managed to pull this off." "Well," Jack replied with a grin, "it helps when you're the guy who approves construction permits for the entire state." The crowd laughed, and Jack basked in their admiration like a rock star, soaking up applause at the end of a sold-out concert. He gave them tours of the office, pointing out every detail with pride. The solar panels on the roof, the custom-built desk made from reclaimed wood, even the espresso machine that looked like it belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant. But Jack wasn't content to simply show off his creation. No, he wanted to make sure everyone understood exactly how he had outsmarted Karen and her HOA cronies. So he told them the whole story, every rejection letter, every ridiculous bylaw, every petty act of revenge. By the time he finished recounting his epic battle against suburban tyranny, his neighbors were practically cheering. "You're a hero," said Mr. Rodriguez from down the street, clapping Jack on the back. "Karen had it coming." "More than coming," Jack replied with a chuckle. "She practically invited it." Word of Jack's victory spread quickly throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Soon, people from other communities were stopping by to see his office and hear his story firsthand. Some came seeking inspiration for their own battles against oppressive HOAs. Others simply wanted to marvel at what one man could accomplish when fueled by equal parts frustration and caffeine. Jack reveled in his newfound fame but never let it go to his head. Well, not too much. He continued living his life as usual, mowing his lawn on Saturdays, jogging in the evenings, but now with an extra spring in his step and a knowing smirk on his face. He had proven that even in the most stifling environments, creativity and individuality could prevail. As for Karen McAllister, she had vanished from public view after resigning as HOA president, retreating into obscurity like a defeated villain in an old Western movie. Rumor had it she'd moved to another neighborhood where HOAs were less strict, or perhaps just less likely to include state officials among their residents. Jack couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for her. Not enough to undo any of his actions, but enough to hope she'd learned something from the experience. After all, life wasn't about enforcing arbitrary rules. It was about embracing creativity and celebrating individuality, even if that meant tolerating an occasional neon green door or inflatable flamingo. In the weeks that followed, Jack's office became more than just a workspace. It became a symbol of resistance against suburban conformity. Neighbors began pushing back against HOA rules they once accepted without question, planting colorful flowers instead of beige ones, installing quirky mailboxes instead of standard-issue models. The neighborhood transformed into a vibrant tapestry of creativity and self-expression, all thanks to Jack's stubborn refusal to back down. One day, as Jack sat at his custom-built desk sketching plans for yet another ambitious project, this time involving rooftop gardens, he glanced out the window and smiled. His backyard office wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who believed in thinking outside the box or outside the bylaws. And so Jack Thompson lived happily ever after, or at least as happily as one can live in a neighborhood where lawn gnomes are still limited to one per yard. Now that you've heard Jack's story, let me ask you this. Have you ever faced an HOA or any other absurd authority figure who tried to crush your creativity? If so, don't let them win. Stand up for yourself like Jack did, and maybe build something amazing while you're at it. If you enjoyed this tale of suburban rebellion and architectural triumph, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment below about your favorite part or your own revenge story, and subscribe to our channel for more hilarious tales of everyday heroism. Thanks for watching.